Scott, I want to get into Vladimir Putin and a few updates on him. So the Washington Post published an article today that argues that Putin's credibility is eroding because Russia has failed to deliver decisive results in Ukraine. So it cannot effectively protect its allies or its assets and appears hesitant to confront US pressure. So at the same time, reportedly frustration is growing with pro-war elites and the public, weakening both Putin's international standing, but also his domestic authority. So the quote that the Washington Post has used is that as allies like Venezuela, Syria and Iran get picked off or bombed, Putin's international promises ring more hollow than ever and his lies are no longer entertained. So several times I've had various military analysts, and Sir Bill Browder says this all the time, that if Putin doesn't deliver on results on the war, he will likely be killed. Because so many Russians inside are saying, what's the point of this war if we're not going to, get headway, and why are we so poor, and vice versa, and goes on. So do you agree that his credibility is eroding inside Russia, especially with these pro-war Russians and Kremlin officials?
Well, let's take it step by step. First of all, the point where I'm in agreement is that he's on the back foot internationally. And he's on the back foot over Ukraine because he hasn't been able to make Ukraine surrender. And what you're seeing right now, again, possibly something for a future videocast, is this all-out war to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure. You try to freeze and black out Ukrainians so that they give up. And there are now the most intense Russian strikes of the invasion going on. The reason why they're so intense with that is that they're not winning on the front line, and that they've got to question how far can they go into 2026 in terms of the resources to support the invasion. In the meantime, he's had a huge setback in Syria, if you want to walk back to the end of 2024. So Russia, which had backed the Assad regime, loses out there. Russia has lost out in Venezuela because, of course, they were backing the Maduro regime as an alternative to American power. They had the prospect that they were going to lose another, if not an ally, another country that worked with them, with the regime in Iran being in trouble. So their international standing, which has always been this myth of BRICS and, that they have all these other countries they work with, they're looking even more and more isolated internationally. And they took a specific punch to the nose from the Americans when the Americans intercepted the tanker that reflagged and renamed itself south of Iceland, even though the Russians said, we've got a sub there, we've got vessels watching this. And the Americans went, yeah, big deal. We're taking the tanker anyway. Now, what does that mean inside Russia? Maddie, I'm just very cautious about this, and I'm cautious about it for a couple of reasons. One is, I think actually the Bill Browder statement kind of works the other way in the near term, and that is, it means that Putin can't afford to give up in a way which is, look, because it's his legacy. His legacy was he was going to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia. The guy's in his 70s. Maybe he's got 10, 15 years left. Maybe he's only got a couple. This was going to be like what I'm going to give the Russian people. Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Vlad the Impaler, and in this case, he impales Ukraine and he makes it part of Russia. Well, he hasn't been able to deliver on that. And he's not even able to deliver on all of Donetsk at this region. I think that just makes him more aggressive. And he's not going to agree to a ceasefire. Now, how long can he continue the invasion? For most Russians, it's like, where are you on a day-to-day basis? Are you still getting fed? Do you still have a house over your head? Do you still have electricity, right? Do you get payments if your relatives get killed? If the Russian state can continue to deliver that, then they probably don't rise up. They don't say, look, enough is enough. When the Russian state stops providing for that basic security, then he's got issues. Other factor, look, in 23, we could talk about the Wagner Group rebellion. And we know that probably had some people in the Russian military who were working with it. Putin survived it, crushed it, right? Who takes a swing at him? Even if he's losing in Ukraine, who takes a swing at him? It's one thing to say he might be killed. Where does it come from? Within his inner circle, intelligence services, military? So I think it's a little bit more complicated with respect to Bill Browder than simply saying, well, this definitely is going to happen.
Just a final question, Scott. Last year when Trump was brokering this peace deal with Israel and Hamas, there was this peace plan, and it involved, down the track creating this board of peace. Now, the update with it today is that Trump has invited President Vladimir Putin to join this board of peace. So this is the international body that intends to oversee Gaza's peace process. Later, we'll delve into other conflicts, but Moscow has replied saying it's reviewing the offer with diplomatic channels. The board, which will initially focus on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire back in 2025, will also kind of go into Gaza's reconstruction. Sir Tony Blair's in this. Other participants will be in this. But, I mean, Vladimir Putin to be on the board of peace. Your reaction to this?
George Orwell is applauding you from his grave. Dear God. All right, we're back to mafia bosses, right? Even if, in this case, you got a mafia boss in Washington who's a man baby at the same time. I get to be president of the world, or emperor, galactic emperor of the world, whatever I'm going to call myself. And it's like he has, just to widen this out, he's proposing now multiple boards of peace. There's going to be a board of peace for Gaza, a board of peace for Venezuela, a board of peace for Ukraine, right? And let's bring it back to Gaza. First of all, it's not even going to work before you get to Vladimir Putin. And let me explain why. We're several months after the October ceasefire. The Israelis occupy about 53% of Gaza. The other 47%, Hamas is still there, has not been disarmed, has not been broken up. But the Trump folks say, oh, we're going to move to phase 2 anyway. Who's on this board of peace, which is largely ceremonial? But let's talk about it. Donald is, of course, right? And then Jared's there, his son-in-law. Real estate developer Steve Witkoff is there, right? And then Tony Blair, who's well known for his peaceful efforts with Iraq in 2003. Here's something that is the real story about this. Not only do you have the Board of Peace, you have an executive board that oversees the Palestinian transitional group, right? The Israelis have said they're not going to accept. They're not going to accept because they don't want any involvement from Turkey or Qatar, because they think Turkey and Qatar helped Hamas. So the idea right now is a flaming non-starter. But what happens? Because Trump and Putin each want to be the big guys and be important, the Kremlin says, well, look, we got invited. We got invited to come onto the Board of Peace. What's going to happen when Witkoff and Kirshner go to Moscow? They're going to go, we'd like to be on your Board of Peace for Gaza, but we really need to discuss Ukraine. Maybe we could have a Board of Peace for Ukraine after we get more territory and after we make Ukraine weak. That's the real risk of this harebrained scheme that's going out there. I will add the fact that, Maddie, I don't want to belittle the story because it's part of the craziness that is there. The reason why I think, however, we may not be facing an abyss with Vlad being on a board of peace for Gaza and for Ukraine is because Trump is also reportedly demanding that anyone who wants to be on his board of peace has to pay him $1 billion. $1 billion. Now, Vlad, I'm sure, could probably put his hands on $1 billion if he wants to, but he really would prefer to spend that money on continuing to invade Ukraine.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you. Let's do this again real soon, and welcome back again.